Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, wherever you are joining in from. Welcome to another live session at the Reactor. My name is Rav, and I'm the program manager here at Reactor London. Before we get into the session, please take a moment to read our code of conduct. We're all here to learn, so please be respectful, please be kind, ask a lot of great questions. The chat will be open throughout. And now I'm going to introduce the session. We're back with the third episode of A Beginner's Guide to AI. If you missed out the first two episodes, I will be putting the link to the playlist in the chat. But today we're going to be talking all about Azure Cognitive Services, and Johan has some absolutely amazing session planned for you. And with that, I am now going to bring him up and let him take away. Hi, Johan.
Hello, great stuff. Thank you very much, Rav, and welcome to our third session in this series, where we'll talk about some of the AI services inside of Azure, more specifically the cognitive services. There's one more session coming around this where we will also cover the open AI services, so look out for that and go register for that so long. But in this specific session, we're going to focus on some of the out-of-the-box services inside of Azure. Now, I thought it's a good idea to just give you a couple of links, and I'm sure Rav will also share these links, in the chat window. The first one is essentially, well, I'm going to chat about this one first, the exam. This is really a high-level overview of the AI 102 course that Microsoft has available. I'm going to quickly pop it up here. You will see it's essentially this course here. Let me just bump my font slightly. And you'll see that in here, you can go and schedule this exam. But if you want to work through the material and the content, you will see that we've got all these items in this collection. Provisioning and managing the services, process and translate text, translate speech, providing a Q&A type solution. All the material is on Microsoft Learn that will assist you in, working through the material on your own, at your own pace. And then, of course, we've also got, as usual, we've got some hands-on exercises and labs, right? Which is essentially the second link, and I'm sure Rav will stick it into the comments. The hands-on labs is essentially the Microsoft official curriculum labs, and you'll see through this we've essentially got, monitoring these services, analyzing text, where you'll go step by step on how to actually get a small, maybe a command line solution going, and you can choose between C# and Python to do that, right? So we've got all of this material available for you to go and check out, and we will get to this last cognitive services API in a little bit more time. So check out those two links, where you can essentially look at schedule the exam if you're confident with the material, and you can also work through those hands-on labs where you can get some hands-on practical experience with some of these cognitive services. So just quickly, and again, my name is Johan Meiberg. I'm a Microsoft technical trainer with Microsoft here in the UK. The agenda for today, we will chat about the Azure AI platform, just a brief sort of touch on the entire platform, some of the components we've already worked through in this series, and then we will, have a look at a high-level overview of the cognitive services inside of Azure. We will then talk a little bit more about, where to run the services, how you provision these services, etc. And then we will look at the individual capabilities of these services, and then we'll finish off with, I'll do a couple of demos in between, but then we'll finish off with a QA session towards the end. All right, so again, welcome from my side, and yes, let's get going. So first of all, just chatting about the AI platform, Microsoft has an extensive AI platform in our cloud services, right? Not only cloud, we've even got some on-prem capabilities, which I'll talk a little bit about later on, sort of edge scenarios. But we really provide you with the entire stack, right? Powerful infrastructure, GPU-based compute that will essentially help you to build out these complex models, working up through the stack using either Azure Machine Learning or Azure Databricks, or your own virtual machines that are doing that, complicated and complex processing and building out these models, to supporting and embracing some of the open source frameworks that are available in this space, right? PyTorch, TensorFlow, scikit-learn. There's a whole bunch of them, and we support most of these in these platforms that I'm talking about. And then, of course, all the familiar other sort of data science tools that you might be using. Think of Visual Studio Code, Jupyter Notebooks, command line tools that might be available in this space. In order to essentially build your own models, so using machine learning to develop and build your own models from demo data that you might have, from real-time data that you might have available, to essentially build from the ground up. Today, though, what we're going to look at is a couple of specific pre-trained models that we've got inside of Azure, right? So as opposed to you taking your own raw data, building a model out of that data, your requirement might be that, we're wanting to build an application that just does some translation, that just checks to see what language the user is busy, texting our support people in, for example. We want to check, for example, if there's a face in this photo, if there's more than one face in this photo, if one of the faces is recognized in this photo that the user has just uploaded, right? We want to maybe check for things like hate speech, these sort of things. So on top of all these frameworks that Microsoft has got, we've actually also got a whole bunch of pre-trained models that essentially allow you to just expose those APIs and embed that capability inside of your custom applications or inside of some of your services for that matter. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. Now, you might be asking the question at this point, what about OpenAI? We'll touch on OpenAI a little bit today, but there's another session coming up next Friday, actually, where we will focus in depth on OpenAI and how you can embrace and use the services inside of Azure around that specifically. So without any further ado here, I thought it's worth just putting an overview of what the different areas are, and you'll definitely see some overlap between these different services. I cannot stress that enough. There's overlap between these services. So if you want to do language detection, you might find that there's more than one service that can do language detection. If you want to recognize faces in a picture or in a video, for example, there might be more than one service that allows you to do that, right? So all the way from NLP or natural language processing all the way through to generative AI, we've got a whole bunch of services that support all of these capabilities: computer vision, some decision-making support options, bot frameworks, etc. And I'm going to touch on most of these, in due time in the session. The next option is where and how, right? And the reality is, if you provision some of these services inside of Azure, you've really got more than one option. You've got either the option to provision an individual service that caters only for a specific capability, or you've got the option to deploy a multi-service resource that caters for all of those capabilities, right? And I can demo this for you in a second. Let me just pop in here quickly. I'm going to go find my Azure AI services, and you'll see on the left-hand side there's all the different Azure AI services, each individual service, and I'll touch on most of those as we go through the session. But you can see that there's also an all Azure AI services option, and you'll see that there's a cognitive services option that is that, one-to-many type scenario. So if I've provisioned a cognitive service inside of Azure, this service will be able to do what all of these services can do, right? So there's a couple of differences between these. Of course, the capability being one of them. My cognitive services resource can do speech recognition. It can do translation. It can do all of those things as a single service with a single endpoint and a single set of keys to secure the endpoint and the API. Alternatively, if I'm not interested in one service that does everything, and maybe we're just interested in a specific service that focuses on vision APIs or something like that, I can go and provision one of these individual services APIs. right? So there you can see there's, for example, the Face API, right? Now you'll notice if I go for Face API here and click the Create button, it's effectively going to prompt me for a bunch of pricing tiers. And you'll see from this perspective that there's a standard tier, there's an enterprise tier, and then there's also a free tier, right? So if I provision the individual service with the specific capability, I get some free API calls that I can make on a per month with that service. If I provision the encompassing service, the service that has all the capabilities, I do not get that free tier in terms of the licensing capability, right? So as I mentioned here, the multi-service resource, one service that kind of rules them all, no free tier involved in that, and this consolidates all your cognitive services billing into a single service with a single key, or well, two keys really, and a single endpoint. Contrast that with option number 2, where I can go and provision individual services. Those services have a free tier and allows me to look at what my billing is for that specific service. So if you want to do, for example, face recognition and some text analysis, and you want to keep the billing for those separate, you might provision the 2 individual services separate from one another. If you don't really care for the billing around that, you don't really care for the free tiering, then you can provision the multi-service resource, the cognitive services service, and that's essentially going to have all of the capabilities rolled into the endpoint and the keys involved with that. Right. So there's multiple ways to provision this. Now, what I've done here is I've essentially, if I look at my all Azure AI services, I've got this cognitive services resource that I created here, and you'll see that, if I scroll down a section, you'll see that there's, decision-making options, my language options, my speech options, for example, vision, document intelligence, everything rolled into a single endpoint, into a single service. Again, contrasting that with each of these services at the bottom here, for example, there you'll see there's a Azure OpenAI service that I'll use in my demos for next week, cognitive search, an individual service that only does cognitive search, none of the other ones. There's no facial recognition inside of that one. And if I click through on this, you'll see that this service is specific to the search service, as I've mentioned. Now, the other question you might have is, how can I run these services? How can I access these services? So we spoke and we touched a little bit now on how do I provision these services, but where do I run these services and how can I run these services? And that brings me up to the next point. There's, again, multiple ways to run these services, right? We've got the option, and this is the default option. If I provision that service, and let me just show this to you. If I go for my all services option and I click on my cognitive services resource that I provisioned early on, if I click on the left-hand side here on keys and endpoint, you will see that it brings up my key, it brings up my region, and that's required for some of these, some of the queries, and then you can see that there is my endpoint, right? So I will essentially require a combination of the endpoint, the key, and those resources, and I can programmatically access the capability and call into this API by using that URL at the bottom there, that endpoint. So that's essentially going to be my URL that I make my REST calls against, right? And pass my data to, and I'll get the results from that. Now the scenario is, what if I want to do some of these capabilities and access some of these capabilities at the edge, right? What if I, for example, wanted to do some of this processing on premises, and it's critical for my business process to get the answer on premises without having to route to the cloud? What if and we can probably step that up one more by saying, what if I've got a scenario where we don't have connectivity? How can I access these capabilities in an offline scenario, right? And fortunately, Microsoft has thought about that, and we've made some of these services available, on premises and at the edge. In fact, it doesn't really matter where you run these services. You can either run them on the edge, maybe in a factory where there's some IoT devices for that matter, or maybe run them even on some resources provisioned inside of Azure. I see that there is a video is unclear, even I cannot read the text. I just wanted to make sure that that is the case for everyone. If it's the case for everyone, or is it just one of you? Anyway, I'm not sure if there's anything I can do about that right now. I apologize for that. Is it the video of my face that's unclear, or is it the video, the screen sharing that's unclear? Maybe just let us know. Rav, if there's...
Okay. I think it looks absolutely fine.
Okay, all right. Maybe it's just...
maybe it's very clear. We can see your video as well as your voice.
Okay.
It's very clear. Maybe, Khurram, your internet could be, I mean, from our side and even on YouTube, it's perfect.
Okay, perfect. All right. So maybe it's just one or two of the folks. That's perfect. Thanks a lot, Rav. Okay, so the way to do this, perhaps it's your end, that is possible. So as opposed to running and accessing these services in the cloud, you can effectively also license. First, you have to license these options, because if you spin up the containerized application, it's essentially Docker applications, Docker images. You can run these containerized applications on-prem or wherever you want to run your containerized applications, and that provides a localized endpoint that connects through to the Azure services and validates your licenses online, and then execute the queries against the API wherever you're running these containers. So we've got the option to also run these API services and expose these endpoints on premises, on IoT devices, wherever you need to run them, even in something like Kubernetes, if you want to run these services in something like Kubernetes, be that in the cloud, on premises, or wherever you need those capabilities. And then on top of that, we've also got some offline container capabilities where the container might not even need to be connected to the cloud in order to keep on functioning, where you can essentially take this entire environment and run it in an offline fashion, where you don't need connectivity to the cloud to run these services. Okay, and I can probably crack open my Docker application here. Let me just... And you can see from this link, I apologize for dragging it on here. You can see from this link that we've essentially got a whole bunch of containers. There's the decision containers, for the anomaly detector. And you can see that there's the availability alongside this. And if I scroll down, there's, language service for key phrase extraction. And you can also see there that some of these services are available in disconnected environments, which implies you can run the container application, and the container application doesn't even have to be connected to the cloud in order to run. So run these services against our cloud infrastructure, run these queries against your infrastructure as containerized applications, and even take some of these container applications and services and APIs offline if you don't, if you're struggling with connectivity, or if you're running some of these capabilities in a disconnected environment. So all of that is also available. And you can see that there's an example where I've essentially just run the command, it's basically a Docker pull or a Docker run command, and I specify this option. And then when you run the containerized application like this, it's going to prompt you for the endpoint URI, and it's going to prompt you for the key, and that you agree to the EULA agreement. And once you've done that, it'll essentially spin up the containerized image using those parameters, start up the containerized application, and allow you to start running queries against this container application endpoint as if it was running inside of our Azure services, for AI in the cloud. Now, in order to do this, you first need to request the container and or the offline capabilities for your subscription. It is not by default enabled for your subscription in Azure. This is something that you need to request from Microsoft, and then we will enable the capability for you to run these containerized applications. Actually, I'm not going to demo anything around this. Maybe if I have time next week, I'll do a short demo around this, but that's, should sort of, drive the point home with regards to where you can be running some of these cognitive services. And then the last part of our conversation today is going to be just delving into the different cognitive and other AI services that we've got inside of Azure, right? First of all, as you might know, we've got Azure services for OpenAI, right? Where we've essentially taken the GPT 3.5, GPT-4, different models, and we allow you to access those models and build applications against those endpoints and APIs. Also use things like embeddings, etc., where we're essentially, converting text into vectors to understand similarities between text. If you think of something like DALL-E, for example, where we allow you to generate images. We'll talk about this in a bit more detail also next week in the last session. And then also the OpenAI Whisper service, which essentially transcribes and translates, speech to text and that sort of thing. So more on this in the next and final session that'll happen next Friday. Now, my plan is essentially to jog through a couple of these services and then maybe do the odd demo in between so that we can look at some of the capability. But I've essentially got largely two demos left that I'm going to be doing. I'm going to show you just a simple command line translation application, and then I'll show you, an application where we use the cognitive search indexing service to build an index that you can programmatically access through your application. So, of course, we've got the bot service, which is essentially a bot framework, which is an open source IDE for developers to build and test bot-related scenarios, where you can expose those bots through different channels. Those channels might be web-based channels. Those channels might be, Microsoft Teams, for example, exposing the bot capability through something like Slack, hooking it up to something like email, right, where you might have consumers and users of your application sending questions and things to a centralized location through one of those channels, and the bot service will then give you almost like a question answer type capability around that, whatever channel you are using. And the channels I mentioned could be anything from Teams, email, a web-based interface, etc. Content safety is an interesting one, because with content safety, what we're really allowing you to do is to check for harmful user-generated or AI-generated, content in applications. And this really talks to, things like, think of inclusivity, etc., where we will check for things like hate speech, sexual explicit content, violent, information content, images, videos, text, and speech, for example, but also, even down to self-harm related content and material where we can detect. And we've essentially got almost like a dashboard type scenario to expose to you, like, hey, the information that's come through now can be categorized according to this. And we've got various severity levels for the content safety, all the way through from severity level 0, which is essentially safe content, all the way through to severity level 6, which is which displays explicit and severe harmful, possibly instructions or actions or text and information. The immersive reader is also interesting. One also talks a little bit towards the inclusivity type scenario, where you will notice that the immersive reader service is essentially providing you with techniques to, for consumers of your application to comprehend information a little bit more, in a simpler fashion. Good example of this is, translating information, translating text, for example, into images, right? So someone that's struggling to read information, right? That sort of thing. So the immersive reader essentially isolates content for, improved readability, displays pictures for common words, for example, highlights parts of the speech or text, for that matter, or even, translates content in real time. So this is one of those services that you might be using to essentially, also translate information into, in real time, split words into different syllables to make it more readable. And then probably a little bit more towards the business end of these services. Those other services I just spoke about probably come across as a little bit more sort of fluffy, right? Probably more solution orientated. Whereas if you look at things like the custom vision API, where we are doing things like image classification, that sort of thing, apply labels to different images, for example, right? So the custom vision API is really that service that applies labels to one or more images and detects objects inside of images. So you might say, well, does this picture contain a banana? Yes, this picture contains a banana. How many bananas are in this picture? Are there any bananas, for example, right? So you can tell this service what a banana looks like by feeding in some sample images, and it'll then allow you to give it some additional custom images, and it'll tell you whether it recognizes a banana and what the relevance of that is, right? What is the accuracy of things, right? So based on what you fed into the custom vision service, telling it what a banana looks like, it will then come back and say there's, a 70% chance that this is a banana, or that this picture contains a banana, for that matter. We've also got the translator, or the document intelligence service. And through the document intelligence service, we are, working with either custom or some standardized documents. Think of things like OCR. Think of scenarios where you've got a specific layout. So, for example, you might have an invoice. You might have something like a receipt. You might have certain, for example, layouts that you've created for custom documents. Even some tax forms from the US we've got in there right now, where you can say, well, we're just feeding in this information and it knows to identify the right top area as where the consumer's address is, for example, right? That sort of thing. But also, we've got some pre-built models here, invoices, receipts, health insurance cards, passports, identity documents, for example, that we can recognize and that we can extract certain informations out using this document intelligence service. And of course, also build your own custom model. So explain to the document, well, not explain, but model your custom layout and document so that the document intelligence service knows where to find the address of the customer, where to find the total for the order, for example. And then lastly, we've also got the face API, right, which is essentially revolves around images and videos where there might be faces in, and where you want to understand, does this image contain a face? How many faces are there? Put a little block around the face so we can see in the image where the service says the face is, right? Including things like accessories, right? We've got we can expose the face by saying, well, this face might be wearing a face mask, but it's still a face. So glasses, hats, those sort of things. It's capable of looking past all of those. Detect noise in the pictures, for example, all those sort of things. Detected face, it's got the concept of a detected face, and then it's got the concept of a persisted face, which essentially is almost like a type of caching service that allows me to say, well, did Johan's face appear in the last 30 minutes, in any of the pictures that were uploaded, just as an example. We're talking about people, individual people, groups, large groups of people, etc. And we've also got a person directory structure that we can essentially help to model some of our information. I don't have demos of that, but I've got a couple of demos that I'll outline for you in a bit. And then we've got, of course, the language service, probably one of our most used sort of services in our AI stack, NLP, or natural language processing service, which is a comprehensive service for working with languages. Think of things like language detection, right? Named entity recognition. Think of things like personal information or personal health information that we can recognize in these documents, language detection, sentiment analysis, right? Summarization, we can do things like key phrase extraction. I'll do a demo for you around this in a second. Also things like entity linking, right? Where we might link different entities together. In fact, we can even do some QA capabilities, questions and answers around this, but we can also do some orchestration and process flow around this, right? So based on the text that's coming in, we can maybe, for example, first detect the language. If it's English, then react like this, then do this, that sort of thing, right? So either use some of the built-in flows, or you can even build your own custom orchestration flows around the language service. So I've got a really simple demo here, and in this demo you'll notice that I've got a couple of reviews. There's one that outlines myself personally, and I can go and say Johan is a Microsoft technical trainer and works in London. He works with the Microsoft React folks and does training and helps customers understand our services. Right, so you'll notice that I've, not on purpose, but I've made a couple of typos in there, but I can essentially save that. And if I just clear this out and just run this application, we will notice all I'm essentially doing is I'm pointing it to my to these different endpoints, right? And I'm essentially looping through all the files in this review folder. And if I run this, it's going to come back and it's going to, interrogate those different files, and then essentially come back and tell me what's contained in those files. Right, and you can see there is, for example, there's the one that I just typed out. Johan is a Microsoft technical trainer, yada yada yada. Sentiment is neutral. You can see there that based on that text, it's extracted some key phrases. Johan London training end customer services, Microsoft Reactor folks, for example, and then some additional links around that. There's a link to Wikipedia for Microsoft and for London, for that matter. And if I actually change this to say the training was terrible, one swore the whole time and did not even make eye contact. Besides, the internet connection was also not great. I have a couple of typos, and let me just fix this one. Let's see. I'm going to save that and just run this again. And I'm hoping that it actually comes back now and says that it's, oh, let me just clear that out. And you should see from the sentiment here that the sentiment is negative. I just changed the text, didn't, the API looked at what was typed in there and connected the dots on my behalf, So again, great capability here, nothing really outside of you just taking your data, passing it through to the API, and it's coming back telling you what is, what's cooking in that text, key phrases, etc., etc. I do, however, want to see Microsoft Reactor. I want to just actually check, see if I run this again, if it also links the Microsoft Reactor in there. I'll be quite impressed if it does that. See if it links the Microsoft Reactor. No, it doesn't. Anyway, I think you're getting the idea, right? So kind of showing the intent here. Right, so that's the language service. You'll see very extensive sort of text and language capabilities. We've also got a specific translator service, and the translator service is essentially going to do things like text translation. It's also going to do, document translation, where you can supply it with documents and it'll translate the entire document. And on top of that, we've also got some custom translator capabilities. So think of the translator service as your mechanism to translate into virtually anything you need to translate into, right? So you might, for example, want to create some technical manuals around your application, just for starters, and then you can essentially build your own model using this translator service, and it'll generate information based on your specific requirements. Currently, we cater for over 100 languages and dialects, this translator service is also quite comprehensive. And again, this is what I mentioned earlier on about there's a huge amount of overlap between these services, right? And so you can see that the translator service can do the translation. The language service might also be able to do some of that, right? So the translator service can identify the language, of course. The language service can also identify the language. So again, there's overlap between some of these services. And then we've also got the maybe more from a vision and video perspective, we've got the video indexer. And the video indexer is essentially a pre-built model that allows you to extract insights and keywords from videos, right? It's essentially got a speech, face translation, and other vision capabilities. Some of the capabilities I spoke about in these earlier services kind of rolled into one service that gives you capability across all of that. So, for example, you can just do use the video model, for example. You can do the audio model if you just want to focus on the audio of the video. And then, of course, you can also do a combination of the video as well as the audio model if you wanted to, build an application around that. I'm going to sneeze. Just give me a second. excuse me. And then the second last service that I wanted to chat about is essentially the vision service. And the vision service, gives you the ability to do some advanced sort of, processing of images and return information based on some of the visual features you might be interested in. The vision service, for example, can do things like, OCR, a document, do some image analysis, for example. I also got some face capabilities to do some facial recognition, spatial analysis, right? Comprehensive people, for example, are moving towards the door, are moving away from the door. If people are moving together, so think, for example, in a scenario where you might have a video camera, and the video camera is, inside of a prison, for example, and you want to alert, the folks in the prison. If all the inmates congregate suddenly around one another, that might imply that there's a fight happening, or someone is being mauled, or someone has got a great picture of the baby or something, that they want to share, from their family, or whatever that criteria might be. So you can go and identify from a spatial analysis perspective, what is happening in a video or in some images, and react on that using your application. And then the last option here, and I've also got a demo around this, is essentially our cognitive search capabilities. And I think this is a very sort of understated service. Our cognitive search is essentially a cloud service that gives you and your developers the option to, and the infrastructure, as well as some additional tooling around building rich search experiences in your application using your own content, right? And exposing that search information using your mobile or enterprise or web-based applications, whatever applications you want to use. So think of things like search engine for text and vector searching, lexical analysis, that's the the analytics of the actual text, optional enrichment of content, right? So think, for example, of having a separate store where you've got some additional information, and if we pick up something, you might bring in some additional metadata that we can add to the index. Of course, it's available via REST API or through Azure SDKs, and I'll do a demo of this. And again, great integration into the Azure machine learning sort of stack, so that you can further build models using this information. So the cognitive search capability is essentially going to take some of your custom content. It's going to crawl over that content, create a full-on index from this, and then provide you with a whole bunch of different options, like, for example, even generate images based on some of the text that you saw, and go and populate some NoSQL tables, for example, with some data and metadata that you can actually afterwards go and query and use in your machine learning scenarios, or just query straight through the application programming interface. So I've got a demo of this, which I just briefly want to run through. I've got a service here. I've got a service here that has got some collateral. There you can see there's a Dubai brochure, Las Vegas brochure. There's a London brochure, for example. I've got a couple of brochures, and then I've got a couple of reviews, right, where folks have created a bunch of reviews, and I'll show one of these reviews to you. And you can see there, great stay yet again, the Buckingham Hotel in London, another great stay on this terrific property. And of course, what we might want to do is we might want to do sentiment analysis around this information, etc. So how do I integrate my own custom data into the service? Well, essentially, what I've got is I've created one of these search services, and you will see that currently it's completely empty. And if I, for example, look at my indexes, there aren't any indexes. if I look at the indexers, there's nothing in there right now. And if I look at my data sources, there isn't anything in there either. I can go for add data source if I wanted to and point it to, a whole array of different services: Azure Blob Storage, SQL Database, Azure Tables, Cosmos DB, for example. So I might have some structured or unstructured data, for that matter, sitting in one of these sources, and I can go and build an index on that information. Now, what I've got here is I've essentially got a script that is going to crawl over those reviews and over those brochures, and is essentially going to build and pack out that index and the indexers, and allow me to start querying that information. You'll see it's busy creating the indexer, and it'll, out of that, then essentially also create that index, and it'll allow me to query and browse some of this data. Right, so it looks like it's complete. If I look at my indexes here, there you can see there's Margie's knowledge index, and I can actually search some of this information if I wanted to. I'll come back to that in a minute. There you can see there's things like fields, right, where it's essentially brought out where it's essentially unpacked some of the metadata that might be relevant in searching this information. You can see that I can go and specify things like course policies here, so that I can essentially query this information from a web browser from another URL, and that the browser doesn't see this as something like cross-site scripting, for example. You can see there's things like scoring profiles, and other semantic configurations. Then there's my indexer, and you will see that that this is essentially my execution history, and you can see that there's some settings around this, and I can go and play around with some of these capabilities. It's also added my data sources, and that data source is essentially this data source that I showed to you in a couple of seconds ago. Now, if I go for my indexes there, I can click on my index, and you will see that it is essentially going to allow me to start searching here for something like London, just as an example, right? And I can go and use that. I can go and essentially use that that index, and you can see there that there's quite a couple of results coming from there. There is not only the results, but there you can see there's some locations that it's implied from that content of mine. You can see that there's some key phrases relating to London, right? And it's essentially tied all this information together in the background on my behalf, and it's keeping all this information exposed via the API. Or I can just drop straight onto the index data and start working through that data and pull this data into my my machine learning service, for example, and start building my own model based on this if I wanted to. And there you can see there's the language, the content. In language, it's picked up as English, for example. Image tags, it's picked up, etc. On top of that, you will also see that if I go for something like my overview here, and I look at something like explore my data, I can go and explore the data in that context. But if I scroll down here and look at my knowledge center, you will see that there is my explore my data option. And in my explore my data option, I can essentially use that search explorer that I just showed to you a couple of seconds ago, where I can do some very basic searches if I wanted to. But I can even go and download a demo application, right? Specify that I want to use the Margie's knowledge index, and you can see that I can actually go and specify in here what I want these things to look like. So I can say that there's, for example, my key phrases I want in the thumbnail. That's a bad example, but I can go for my different locations, and I can go for the actual content there, and it'll essentially, create a little demo app that I can effectively go and, do a search for example, and go and search for something like London, and you'll see, it's just a simple single page HTML page that it generates for me. That's slightly customizable, but it gives you an idea of how I can essentially programmatically integrate and interact with this cognitive search service of ours. Right, so cognitive search service is if you want to bring a comprehensive search solution to your application that uses some of our built-in AI capabilities, facial recognition, build your own index, and from there, even look at things like different skill sets, etc. All right, so I hope that was a decent enough introduction to some of our cognitive services. Ending off with a cognitive search capability there. This used to be called the Azure Search capability, but again, as you can see, there's lots of capability around that. Comprehensive search solution that you might embed inside your application. That really brings me to the end of my material here. I want to see if there's any questions.
Hi, Johan. Thank you. So just going through the chats now. So we have one question from Cloud Therapist. Nice name. So can run them on Azure Stack Hub or Azure Stack Edge. So I think what they try to mean is, I think in between your presentation, could that be run on Azure Stack Hub or Azure Stack Edge? Perhaps that was in between the question.
So thanks for that. So yes, that's a great question. Absolutely, I think currently on Azure Stack, we essentially only support Windows containers, but I'm talking under correction here. But the reality is wherever you can run containerized applications. So at the edge, where whether it's an ARM-based device, it doesn't really matter as long as you can essentially spin up a containerized image, it should run there. I haven't obviously tested ARM-based devices specifically, but I know from my IoT exposure that I've had inside of Azure that it should not really be a problem to run it on an ARM device. But yes, we should cater for most of those scenarios. We've got the containerized solution specifically to cater for those edge scenarios, right? So that is definitely the plan. So yes, I'm confident that it'll run on most of those scenarios.
Okay, so next question we have is it also capable to identify the direction, position of an object in a stream / image, example, car / person moving forward or towards backwards?
Yes, it's definitely got that spatial recognition capability that it's got, right? So it depends, of course, Nazir, I think, if that's your name. It depends, of course, on which service we are talking about here. But yes, for our image processing services and even video processing services, yes, we've got that spatial sort of recognition capability to understand, is there a person in the image, and or is there a person in the video, or is there a face in the video, and is the face moving towards the door, for example? So yeah, absolutely, we've got those capabilities. Yeah.
And we have another question from Cloud Therapist. Do I have to be running Windows and/or Azure in order to access the Azure AI API services, or can I access them via an edge computer or a small ARM-based device?
It's a REST API, so from wherever you can make REST calls, right? So you can be doing it from a smart watch if you wanted to, as long as it's got internet access and can make HTTP requests. So wherever you want to be accessing it from.
Okay, I think that's all the questions we have.
Yeah, looks like it.
Yeah.
Anyway, I really hope that was valuable for everyone and that you at least learned a couple of things. So just from my side, thank you very much. I hope you have a great weekend, and I hope you learned a couple of things. Thank you very much. Thanks, Rav.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.